Thank you for coming today. My name's Helen Harden. I am a professor in psychology. I'm also chair of the Institutional Review Board, which is what you're here to find out about today. So participating in what we're doing today will earn you your certificate that you need in order to be able to do research with human participants here at UNI. Make sure when you came in that you signed in on the sheet that they have, because that's how they'll know that you are here, and then your certificates will be sent to you afterwards. There are also a couple of handouts, and I want to mention a couple of other things coming up. On Monday, October 3rd, from 2 to 4:30 here in the same place, there is a workshop on ethics and scholarship for graduate students. This is not dealing with the IRB. This will be ethical issues such as ownership of works, how do you know who owns a certain idea, as well as student-mentor relationships. So if you're interested in that, you need to RSVP, so we'll have enough space for people, and you can do that at the table in the front as well. You also should have picked up when you came in a evaluation form, so if you'll remember at the end, whether I remember to remind you or not, to fill that out and leave that out front when you're taking off as well. So we're doing videotaping of this today, and because of that, I'm going to ask you if you have questions or things to hold those. Go ahead and make a note of them, jot them down, and hold them till the end, and should have a little bit of time for questions at the end. You can also always contact me afterwards if you have questions about anything. So this is going through. I'm going to talk about today a little bit on the historical context of ethical principles in research. Why are we concerned with these things? What are some problems that have happened in the past? We're also going to talk about some of the main principles that you need to be concerned about and how you can apply those to your own research in whatever area it is. We'll also touch on how to navigate the IRB process. When do you need to talk to us? What do you need to let us know about? What forms do you need to fill out? And so on. And as I said, afterwards, I'm always available to talk with you if you have questions about a study and you're not sure how to do something or what the best way to approach something is. Feel free to contact Anita Gordon, who's standing over here, the IRB administrator, or me, and we can help you with that. We have a lot of experience with figuring out creative ways to try to do things to minimize risks and still be able to investigate the question you're interested in. So I'm going to give you a little historical perspective. And there were horrible things going on before this, but one of the things that really brought the issues of ethics in research to people's attention were the medical experiments that went on during World War II, carried out by the Nazis in the concentration camps. And these are some pictures demonstrating some of the things that they did, but I'm sure you're aware that they did research looking at the effects of poisons, at the effects of starvation, at freezing temperatures, at heat, at altitude. And they justified these experiments because they felt that the information was useful, the information would save lives, and these people were going to die anyway, and so it was a useful way to get information from them. The international community didn't really buy this as an excuse, however, and 23 German doctors and administrators after the war were charged with war crimes because of their roles in these studies. They were put on trial for crimes against humanity, and 16 of them were put to death and 7 were sent to prison. So they were all convicted because of their role in these experiments. As a result of this trial, the first International Code of Research Ethics came out. So it's called the Nuremberg Code. It came out in 1947, and this was part of the verdict of these war crime trials. As part of this verdict, they came out with 10 things that they felt were important in research. And among those, one of the most important ones, and one of the ones that we hold most central today, is the idea of voluntary consent. You shouldn't do research on people without their saying it's okay, and without their truly giving their voluntary consent, not just saying it's okay because the alternative is worse. They also discussed the fact that you need to make sure the benefits outweigh the risks. So any research that has higher risks must have higher benefits. It might be okay to do something that might upset people if we're going to potentially cure cancer, but you might not want to do something that's going to cause that psychological harm if all you're going to find out is something that we already knew. Another principle that came out of the Nuremberg Code was the importance of the participant or the subject being able to stop whenever they want. So even if people agree to be in a study, we also need to make sure that if at any point later they change their mind, they decide this is too upsetting, this is not what they thought it was going to be, whatever, they can get out of that and stop their participation. Okay. So, did this Nuremberg Code impact the behavior of American scientists? No. There are a lot of examples of research that went on even after this that used questionable research practices. And most of the ones that I have up here are from, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But there are still things going on today, and I'll mention one that was fairly recent. But there are still a lot of these kinds of issues, even with the protections that we put into play, where sometimes these things happen. What I'm going to talk about in a little more detail, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, hopefully you're familiar with, and then a Guatemalan study from about the same time. But just to briefly kind of remind you of some of the others from various areas, the United States, in addition to doing these studies with smaller groups of people, did thousands of experiments from the 1944 to 1974 on radiation. These studies were often done without people's knowledge, and the government justified it because if people knew we were dumping radiation on their town, that would probably upset them, right? So it's better just not to tell them. But in these studies, there were at least two that I've found that involved Iowa. In one case, in the 50s, they dumped chemicals in the air to look at dispersal patterns. These are potentially harmful chemicals. They did this without anyone's knowledge, and then they would go and look at, the effects on people afterwards. There was also a study in the 60s at the University of Iowa hospitals where they injected babies with radiation to test the doses or to test the effects of it without telling the parents or getting the parents' permission. And this was all done by the U.S. government, being justified by we need to do this to protect our people because of the Cold War and so on. There are also examples of other groups doing questionably ethical things. In the Willowbrook study, which again went on for years, this involved children who were at a home in New York for cognitively impaired individuals. And during this period of time, you didn't really, if you had a son or daughter who was mentally impaired, you didn't really keep them at home. Sort of the norm was to send them away. And so one of the places that you could send them for help was Willowbrook. And what the people there wanted to do was to look at the effects of hepatitis and how that could be controlled, because that was a big problem. They had a lot of kids living there together, and so hepatitis tended to spread. And so they told the parents that in order for their children to be accepted at Willowbrook, they had to agree for their kids to be in this study. So in one sense, they were getting consent, but in another sense, they weren't giving the parents the whole story. Basically, the parents were told your only option is to agree to be in the study or not to have your child here. And the parents also weren't told of all of the potential problems of hepatitis. They were just told, your child will give him a small virus. This is not a big deal. They weren't given all the details of it or of how that would be transmitted. And so in that study, they actually gave these children hepatitis to see the effects of it. The Milgram study involved bringing people in and leading them to believe that they were shocking another person and encouraging them to do so and continuing to do so. In the Jewish chronic disease hospital study, doctors actually injected patients with live cancer cells without their knowledge. Again, the justification was if we told them, that would be kind of upsetting. So they told them they were doing a skin test and injected them with cancer cells to study the progression of that. The Stanford Prison Study is another one by psychologists. In this case, people were brought in and asked to play the role of guards and prisoners. And the study quickly became a problem where people started taking their roles too seriously. And then a sociologist study, the Tea Room Trade Study, deals with issues of privacy. In this study, a man was interested in behavior in San Francisco at the gay bathhouses of the time and other places where gay men would go to secretly meet. And so he would agree to be a lookout for them and then look at their plates on their cars, find out who they were, and then go and interview them separately from that, not telling them that he already knew them from this other setting. So a lot of issues, some dealing with physical harm, definitely giving people disease, but also potential psychological harm, making people think that they're hurting someone else, and harms to privacy. And so these are all some of the things that we'll talk about as we go through this. I want to illustrate the Tuskegee study a little bit more because this one really brought to light some of the ethical issues and was a big impetus for some of the regulations and protections that we have today. So this study began in 1932, and it was done by the U.S. Public Health Service. And basically, they went to poor black sharecroppers in a rural area in Alabama, and they recruited 600 people. And these men were told that they were being recruited, that they had been chosen to get free medical care. And so basically, they weren't told that it was a study or that they were doing anything like that. It was just basically, you know, as part of this thing the government's doing, we're going to give you free medical care. 400 of these men had syphilis initially, 200 did not. And what the researchers were interested in was the progression of the disease. And so they followed these men for 40 years. During that time, they were given them procedures that are painful that had no medical benefit, like spinal taps, just to look at the effects of it. They also never told the men that they had syphilis. They didn't give it to them, but they didn't tell them that they had it. And in the 40s, when penicillin came out as a simple and cheap cure for syphilis, they also didn't tell the men about that or give them that drug. And for those of you who are familiar with this, syphilis, it's a horrible way to go. It causes insanity, it causes blindness, a lot of problems. And these men were also, because they didn't know they had it, potentially spreading it to their partners and other people. So this study, as I said, continued for 40 years, and the only reason it stopped, even in the 1970s, long after we knew how to cure syphilis, was that a journalist found out about the study and broke it in the newspapers. And this caused the U.S. Public Health Service to have to act on it. But until that point, they were continuing to do research on these men without their knowledge. Another study that just came out last year, and so that, you know, this is one of the things, a lot of these things go on and you don't even hear about them for a while. But from that same time period, some of the same people were studying syphilis in Guatemala. And in this case, they actually gave people syphilis so that they could study the disease. They purposely infected over 1,300 prostitutes, prisoners, mental patients, and soldiers in Guatemala with gonorrhea or syphilis without their knowledge. You know, and they did this initially by, they took prostitutes who either had syphilis or they infected them with it, and then brought them in to have sex with inmates. That wasn't being effective enough at spreading it, and so then they started spreading it more directly by directly exposing people to it. There's still information coming out about this. There's a presidential commission that just came out and an apology that came out recently. But it does seem that only some of the people were ever treated, and that there were at least 83 who died because of complications of the disease that they gave them. And again, they justified this as, oh, you know, there are benefits. We can find out about this disease. There's a lot of good to come out of this. And I think in both cases, kind of the underlying thing that they didn't say was that, you know, and these people aren't worth as much. You know, so these, we're taking poor people or prostitutes or prisoners, and, you know, maybe it's okay to do that kind of thing with them, which is the same logic that the Nazis were given. Even though we condemned them for that, we had the Nuremberg Code that we said, yes, that's a good idea. We kind of ignored that ourselves. But thankfully, the Tuskegee study really brought to light and shocked Americans in terms of what was happening. And as a result of this, the National Research Act of 1974 came about. This led the Tuskegee study and finding out about that led to a Senate investigation and to passage of this National Research Act. Two of the things that came out of this act were the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report, if you're interested in research and ethics, it's a fairly short document. It's only about 7 pages or so, that really kind of goes through and talks about what are these important issues and expands on them more. So this was the first American document. The Nuremberg Code was more of an international one to look at these sorts of things. There also came out of this a code of federal regulations that we'll talk about, which are part of the regulations that created IRBs and that give IRBs sort of the things that we work with when we're making decisions about research. Okay. Even with this act, though, I just want to mention briefly, things still haven't ended in terms of unethical or questionable research practices. A more up-to-date example is the 1999 case of Jesse Gelsinger. He was an 18-year-old good-looking guy that was doing well, going to school. He had a disease, and he agreed to be in a study looking at gene therapy. At the time, he was doing well with the medications he was on, and he was healthy. Everything was fine. When he agreed to be in the study, it later came out that they didn't give him all the information, or his parents all the information. They didn't tell him that the previous people that this had been tried on had had serious side effects. They downplayed the fact that he was only the third human to get this therapy, and that in monkeys, some of the monkeys that this had been tried on had died. But he agreed to do it because he felt research was important and he wanted to help others with his disease. So he got started in the gene therapy trial, and 4 days later he was dead. And there are other cases that you hear about. There was a case in Great Britain fairly recently where several people were harmed by their participation in research, and there were some questions about consent there as well as compensation. So if you give people who are poor $5,000 to participate in a study, is that really voluntary, or are they in a situation where they feel that they must do it? Or, as the US did in the past, if you take drug addicts and give them drugs in exchange for doing research, is that really voluntary? And so some of these issues are still things that come up and that we deal with. So the Belmont Report, which came out in 1979, talks about 3 important basic principles. The first one of these is respect for persons. So the idea here is that you have to have voluntary consent. You need to really let people know what they're in for, what the potential risks are, what the potential benefits are, and make sure that they are freely giving their consent. And we'll talk about a little later some of the issues with that, of how you don't want to make people feel like they have to do something as well. Second principle is beneficence. This obligates researchers to try to maximize benefits and minimize harms. So if there are 2 ways to do a study and one way has fewer risks, you want to do it that way. Okay? So basically keeping in mind this risk-benefit ratio. It might be okay to have a little more risk if there's more benefit, but you want to try to minimize the harms as much as possible. And then finally, one that we don't think about as often, but is also very important, especially in light of some of these studies I've been telling you about, is the idea of justice. And this requires that the benefits and burdens of research be fairly distributed. Basically, what this is getting at is it's not okay to do research on a bunch of poor men in the rural South and then take the benefits of that research and apply it to rich people in the Northeast. Okay, we want to make sure that we're not targeting people for research because they are convenient, like prisoners, or because they might be more open to doing this, because they're uneducated, or because they have less money. And we also want to make sure that the populations that we do this research with get the benefits of it. So a more modern example would be, we don't want to go into rural Africa and test a drug for AIDS, and then once we've tested it, just pull out and make that so that that drug's not even available to those people anymore, and just give it to people in the US who have lots of money. Okay, so you want to make sure that the benefits as well as the burdens of research are fairly distributed, that everyone has a chance to benefit, particularly if their group has been involved in the research behind what you're doing. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal regulations, and you don't need to know that it's 45 CFR Part 46 and all of this, but this is basically the regulations that IRBs use when we're making our determinations about studies. So I'm going to talk about some of these things in light of ways that they'll be relevant to you. There are also some additional parts of 45 CFR 46 that deal with special populations, and we'll mention this a little bit more later. There are additional protections for pregnant women, especially in medical sorts of studies, for prisoners, for children. And these are groups that are seen as more vulnerable, and so there are additional things that need to be done to make sure that those people are truly consenting. Another thing that came out of this, these regulations is the idea of a Federalwide Assurance. And what this is it's issued by the Office of Human Research Protections, which is the federal agency that oversees research in all the government agencies as well as any entity that gets government funds, which could be drug companies, could be universities, anything. UNI has signed a Federalwide Assurance, or an FWA, and basically what this says is that UNI has agreed that all research with human participants done here will be reviewed by the IRB and that we'll make sure that they're in accordance with these regulations. So the regulations that we're talking about don't only apply to federally funded research, they definitely apply there, but because of this Federalwide Assurance, we have assured the government essentially that we're going to make sure that all research at UNI follows these procedures and is done using these ethical guidelines. So the first issue when we're talking about human participants research is, what is research? And sometimes there are things that can be questionable with this, and with all the stuff with ethics, it's not clearly black and white. So, okay, we can probably all agree giving syphilis to people without them knowing it is bad. But there might be other things that some people might say is okay, some people might see less of an ethical problem with. And so a lot of the things that we talk about are, to an extent, interpretations. The federal regulations give us guidelines, but they don't say exactly in every specific case what should happen. But these regulations apply to anything that fits the definition of research. And as they define it, it's a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation, designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And I'm going to talk about how we interpret that in a second. You also need to know what is a human. Human participant is a living individual about whom you either collect data through intervention or interaction, so anything where we've got a systematic information that we're looking for and we're actually interacting with people or intervening with people, or we get identifiable private information. So this involves not only things where you're actually talking to people or interacting with them directly, but it may also involve archival data that you get about people if it involves private information. If you get records from a company on the employees and it includes identifying information, that would also apply and count as a human participant. So here at UNI, what kinds of projects need review? And we'll go through a little later kind of a review of this on one of those sheets that you got. The first criteria is it research? And so some of the things we look at there is it a systematic data collection intended to contribute to generalizable knowledge? And this gets to be hard because some people say, well, I'm just doing this study and I'm only interested in this one group. But in general, most things that we investigate are going to be examples of systematic data collection. We want to be able to generalize the results, if not to all people, to others like this. So if you do a study of people who knit, you may not want to generalize the results to everyone, but you do want to find out some things that tell us about people more generally or about knitters more generally. One way to think about this that we've suggested for people is to think about whether the results will be made public and what they're going to do with the results. So one of the ways that we distinguish things is if you're doing something and all you're looking at is for internal purposes. So for example, the student evaluations that professors get filled out at the end of the year. That information is used by the university, it's used by the professor, but it's only used for quality improvement types of purposes. It's not going to be published, it's not going to be used to make statements about, well, this kind of class, this kind of professor does better in, or kind of more generalizable things. It's only something that's private. In most cases where you're making results public through presentation or research articles or internet reports or so on, those would be research. And if you have questions about whether what you're doing counts as research, ask us. Because asking beforehand is fine. Doing it and then trying to disseminate it later can be a big problem. Usually for journals, you have to assure them that you've followed ethical guidelines. There could also be internal issues with that, particularly since most of your graduate students, for your graduate research projects and your theses, those are considered research, and so those definitely need to go through the process. Okay, a second issue is whether it's research with human subjects. So, like we talked about, it's either interacting or having some sort of intervention with the people or getting private information. So in this case, if we're doing something where we're not interacting and not getting at all private information, if we're just observing people in a public place, then that wouldn't be considered research by the federal definition and wouldn't need review. So go through a few examples of those. So what kinds of projects need reviews? Some examples might be if you want to mail out a survey to get people's opinions on something, an action research project in a local school. A lot of times teachers want to know if a particular way of teaching math or getting writing involved in the teaching of math helps students learn better. Those sorts of things would be examples. Testing athletes' physiological responses to running. Collecting interviews of Postville residents to obtain opinions after an ICE raid. So looking at how the people within the town reacted to that. But they can also be things where you're not interacting with people, like an investigator, getting individually identifiable information on treatment outcomes of patients. Even though they're recording the information in a coded way, because they're actually looking at the private information, that would count as research. Or again, a teacher using student artifacts, looking at papers a student has already turned in the previous semester. Even though those data are already existing, you're not interacting with the people directly, that would still be considered research because it's still private information that you're getting. Examples of things that don't need review would be, like I mentioned before, things that are project evaluation or quality improvement only for internal use. So if you want to find out within your company how satisfied your employees are, and the reason you want to know is so that you can make them happier, just for internal uses, it doesn't need it. We've also decided on this one, partially for practical reasons, that class research projects usually don't require going through the IRB. This is, again, not theses and graduate projects, research projects, those would need to. But other projects you might do in class don't need to, as long as, one, you're not sharing the results outside of class, so you don't plan to take it to a conference. If you think you might take it to a conference, then go through the IRB. And as long as it's no more than minimal risk, and we'll talk about what that means later, but basically the risks of being in the research are very slow, and you're looking at adults from a non-vulnerable population. If it's a class project and it's a simple study, but it's with prisoners or with children, it still needs to go through the IRB. Okay, so only things like a minimal risk anonymous survey that you might give to people or interviews you might do with adults who are able to give their free consent. Data collection about organizations wouldn't need review if you're not asking about people. So if you call companies and you say, how many employees do you have and how many benefits from this list of benefits do you offer? You're not asking them about people, you're asking about the organization, so that wouldn't count as research or as something that would need IRB review. Again, business studies where the results aren't made public, they're only used for internal purposes, or observations of public behavior when you're not interacting with the person. If you're going to go up to people and ask them things when you're observing them, then that would need IRB review. You wouldn't if you're just going to watch them. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of examples here. Department of Residence at UNI conducts activities on campus during the summer for incoming students. They ask them to complete a satisfaction survey at the end of each session, and they use this to decide which sessions they should keep and which they should drop. So, does this one need IRB review? Yes or no? No, okay, because it's only going to be used internally. It's intended to evaluate the orientation program. It's not collecting data that they're going to present or use in any other way. Okay, next one. A staff member wants to know whether UNI students are committed to the university by looking at how many people wear UNI shirts. And so they position themselves in the union and count the number of students wearing UNI clothing for an hour. Would this need review? No. Okay, because all you're doing is looking at public behavior. You're not interacting with them. You're not obtaining private information. You're not taking photos of them. You're just looking at them in a public place. Okay. This one, an investigator hopes to understand business outcomes for students who lost their businesses in the flood of 2008. So to do this, they're doing interviews with a sample of business owners from Cedar Rapids. Would you need review for that? Yes, okay, because here you are trying to get at more general information and you're interacting with the people. Okay. And then, we have one more. A faculty member wants to understand more about attitudes of patrons at a local business regarding Christmas shopping. So with the permission of the store owner, they stand on a public sidewalk outside the store and ask people to complete a short survey. Would you need review for this one? Come on, yes, no? Yes, okay. Because again, you're trying to get generalizable knowledge, and it does involve interaction with the participants. Okay, oh, there's one more on here. Okay, for a senior thesis, a student has access to existing data from a local business that they're working with as an intern. The data set contains individual level private information pertaining to company employees. Would you need review for that? Yes. You would, because even though you're not interacting with people, it would still probably need review. And the only reasons that it wouldn't would be if it was a publicly available data set that had no identifiers at all. Okay. But in this case, even if the data have some identifiers, we'll talk about this later, in conjunction, those can individually identify the people involved. So if you aren't sure if something needs IRB review, if you think that you might want to publish or present it in the future, if you've got a research question, if it's something that you might develop into a larger project, then go ahead and submit it to the IRB, or at least ask us, and as I said, we can give you some information on, which things may need review and which may not, or what aspects of it might do that. Okay, I'm going to talk about the Institutional Review Board itself and what it is, what our responsibilities are. Some of you probably are familiar with these things, but for those of you who aren't, the IRB is authorized, as I mentioned, by the government regulations, federal regulations, and basically they require that any institution, so again, most universities and colleges, drug companies, nonprofits, anything that gets some federal funds for research needs to have an institutional review board. The Institutional Review Board is a committee at that location that's charged with reviewing research that occurs there to assure that the participants' rights and welfare are protected. And so really what we're there for is not to protect the institution, though sometimes people feel that way, but our main goal is to protect the participants. And secondarily, we also want to try to protect the PIs. So there may be cases where, in a particular research question, we have some concerns about the safety of the student doing the research, and so we might make suggestions in that case as well. But we're there to protect the participants first and foremost. Anyone who wants to do research at UNI, whether they're faculty, staff, or student, anyone affiliated with UNI, needs to get IRB review and approval for their project before they start the research project. So when you're doing your thesis or you're doing other projects, keep in mind that you need to go through this process before you can start doing your research. Not before you start looking at the literature and things, obviously, but before you start doing any contacting of participants or recruitment or anything like that. The IRB is made up of, or it has to be made up of at least 5 members, including at least one non-scientific person. The idea there is to get a more lay or outsider viewpoint. At least one person who's not affiliated with the organization, again, to get outside viewpoints. And the idea is that you want to bring together people that have different perspectives. And so what we've tried to do here at UNI is get people from different departments that do research. We also have some people with particular knowledge of some vulnerable populations. We have several research studies that involve prisoners. And so in that case, we have people that we call prisoner advocates who are there to look at things from the perspective of the prisoner because of their familiarity with that group. We also have people who do qualitative and quantitative research, people who do physiological as well as more psychological or sociological research, and we have at least one outside person to kind of make it so that it's not all UNI. So here at UNI, the IRB is within the Office of Sponsored Programs, which is in East Bartlett. The institutional official is Christy Twait. The IRB administrator I introduced you to a little bit earlier, Anita Gordon, and then I'm the chair of the IRB. So again, if you have questions about anything when you get started with your study, and it can actually save time and make a better study if you've got questions if you bring it to us beforehand. So don't feel like you have to make your study fit the suggestions that we have online. You know, we can find creative ways to do things so that you can get your question answered. And actually, while at some institutions there is a habit of IRB saying, no, you can't do this research, we don't really do that here. I mean, I can't think of a single project that we've said, no, there's no way you can do this study. Now, we have said you need to do these modifications, or you need to think about how you could do this differently. That's really common. Almost all studies are going to have some suggestions and some ways that you could approach the problem without or by minimizing harms, but we're not going to say, no, you just can't do this at all. Okay? And we are going to give you feedback as well and ideas for how you could do it. And I think that's one of the things that isn't always true of every IRB in the country, but one of the things that we really try to do is to get you feedback that's useful and to try to help you make a better study. And so really you should think about it more instead of, you know, this is a hurdle I have to jump through, as this is a sort of additional check on my research that can help me think about some issues that I might not have thought of. It's hard to think about them when it's your own study, and that can help me get a better product. And so, like, often when I do reviews, there may be things that I require people to address for ethical reasons or to be in guideline with the regulations, but I also sometimes make other suggestions that they don't have to do, but that are just things because I see probably 150, 200 research projects a year. Through doing all of that, I get ideas about different ways you could approach problems, and sometimes I can share those with people and help them with that. Here's a list of our full board, and so you can see we have people from a variety of different topics or different areas on campus: social work, marketing, special education, athletic training, psych, political science, biology, sociology, anthropology, criminology. We also have some community members and prisoner advocates. And you know, you can also feel free to talk to any of these people. If you're in a department with one of them, they'd be happy to talk to you about some of these issues. Okay, so what criteria do we look for in terms of IRB approval? So one that I've been talking about a lot already is that the risks to participants are minimized. And we're going to go through some of the common things that come up with that and talk about how those can be dealt with. That the risks are reasonable in anticipation of benefits. So again, looking at that risk-benefit ratio. Selection of participants is equitable. If you're doing research on prisoners because you know, if there's a reason for that, you want to understand how people become domestic abusers, and that's a good place to find those people, then, you know, that makes sense. But if you're doing research on prisoners just because they're handy, that's not a good reason. You also need to get informed consent from everyone in the study, and we'll talk about some more details of that in a minute. Make sure it's appropriately documented. Make sure you go, as the study is continuing, that you look at the data to ensure the safety of the participants, and that you protect their privacy and confidentiality. And so we'll also talk about several issues related to confidentiality. So, as I also mentioned, there are several groups that we have additional protections for that we're going to be especially concerned with. This includes children. So with children, you generally need to get their parents' permission for research. Prisoners, again, because they're in a vulnerable place where they don't have a lot of control over their lives. They may feel coerced more easily than others. Pregnant women, if you're doing a study that involves something that could harm them. Obviously, if you're just asking questionnaire, survey questions, it probably wouldn't matter for that. Mentally disabled persons or people with cognitive deficits, people with Alzheimer's, economically or educationally disadvantaged persons, anyone else that might not be able to freely consent or might need some special consideration in terms of how you're doing that. There are 3 types of review, and really the first 2 you don't need to be that concerned with. I'll talk about some distinctions between them, but basically the IRB makes the distinction, and what you do from your end at the beginning is the same for both. Either exempt from continuing review or expedited. There are also some studies that go to full board, as I'll mention later. And then there are other ways that you may interact with us, including asking for modifications or doing closure. Okay, so the first category, and this is probably about 40 to 50% of the protocols that we get here at UNI, are deemed, after we review them, as exempt from continuing review. So what this means, if you get that, is that your study was considered minimal risk. So a lot of times this is the case for anonymous surveys or using archival data, things like that. The review process for these usually takes less than 2 weeks, so it's a pretty quick turnaround. It doesn't require continuing approval, so for the other categories we'll talk about, every year you'll have to fill out a form saying how the study's going. But you still do need to submit it for review, and you still do need to ask for approval for changes. So if you're doing a study and it's approved as exempt from continuing review, but you decide that you want to now go collect data in a new location, or you want to now add a couple questionnaires, you still need to get prior approval for that as a modification. So it's kind of a confusing term, the exempt, but you do still need review of those. And like I said, we make the determinations on that, so you don't really have to worry about that much. Most studies are either going to fall in that category or expedited, which is also things that are minimal risk, maybe a little higher risk, maybe people can be identified, might be some confidentiality issues. The main difference between these and the exempt ones are that you do have to, after a year, fill out either a closure form or a continuing review form. And basically this is part of the regulations just to say the study is done or the study is ongoing and we haven't had any problems, and so on. You would still need to put in modifications in terms of changes. And for both of these cases, we'll look at the forms, or I'll tell you about the forms a little later. But basically, in terms of the process, you're going to submit your application, fill out the form that's online that tells us about your study and all the different issues with it. You're going to turn that in to the IRB office, and the first thing it does, it goes through administrative review. So they make sure, do you have everything here you're supposed to? Have you been through training? All of that. Once it passes that, it gets sent to a reviewer. And if it falls into these first two categories, which is the majority of studies, then it would just get sent to one reviewer, and that person will get back to you within about a week and a half, usually with some questions or issues for you to address. Most of the time they're fairly minor, but there's usually, I would say, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, there's something that needs to be addressed. We'll send you an email, then you just email us back with those changes. After you've submitted that first proposal, you don't have to submit the whole thing again. All you've got to do is answer the questions we have in the email. Hopefully that takes care of it, and then we can send you an email saying that your study's been approved and you can go ahead and get started. You get a formal letter a little later, but that would let you go ahead and get started with your study. Okay. And so usually the process takes about a couple weeks for most studies. It kind of depends if it's a busy time of year, because we're professors who are doing the reviewing. Sometimes it might take a little longer, but I've also had ones that have gotten approved the same day. So it's possible, but you probably want to allow a couple weeks. For some studies, you might want to allow a little longer, though. These are the ones that go to full board. And again, this is a determination that the IRB makes, but you can kind of make a guess as to whether your study might go to full board. These are ones that involve more than minimal risk. They might have deception. They often include vulnerable populations. These have to be reviewed by the entire IRB, and we have to receive them 2 weeks before the meeting. So because of that, for these, you need to particularly plan ahead, because the review process is going to take longer for everyone to get this and to get it out at the meeting. We have the meetings once a month, and you can come to the meeting. It's encouraged so that you can answer questions. Sometimes that speeds things up. But you do need to take into account the review for these can sometimes even take a couple months if there are questions that you can't address right then and we have to wait till the next meeting. To give you an idea of what sorts of studies might go to full board, most of the ones that we have that go to full board, the ones that I can think of, typically either involve children and doing something more than, just asking them questions about something. So maybe doing something a little higher risk, maybe physiological with children. It might also involve prisoners. So several studies that we've had that involved interviewing prisoners about things because they're a vulnerable population have gone to full board. Or people with mental illnesses. Sometimes in the psychology department we'll have people who, for example, want to take people who have a history of self-harm and have those people watch an upsetting movie. That might be higher risk, so that might go to full board. or other studies that might involve deception, where you're led to believe that, or someone's insulting you and you're led to believe they're another participant in the study. So that can kind of give you an idea, and if you have questions about whether you think your study might be full board and you want to ask some of us, we can give you an idea on that so that you can plan ahead, and so you can think ahead for, you know, allowing that time, especially for something like your thesis that you don't want to get slowed down on. Okay, so what is minimal risk? I've been saying, you know, if it's more than minimal risk, it goes to full board. Basically, minimal risk is what you would expect in day-to-day life. So no study is going to have no risk, and you can't put in your consent form, there are no risks to this. I mean, if nothing else, somebody can fall on their pencil and put their eye out, right? They could have something happen. So we can't take away all risks, but the risks are no greater than what they might ordinarily do. So if you go up and you ask people questions about what they think about political candidates, that's probably not more upsetting than things that happen to them all the time. Or if you have people, you know, read a section of text and answer questions about it, these are things that happen in day-to-day life. Okay. You could also have physiological measures that are pretty low risk. You know, if we're going to measure people's heart rate or things like that, these are things that don't involve additional risk beyond day-to-day life. Okay, I'm going to go through some of the protections that we want for these various groups, some of the things to think about, and we're going to put these slides, I mean, I encourage you to take notes as well on things, especially if it reminds you of things in your own study, but we're going to put these online so that you can have access to them, because I think these are good things to review when you're filling out your forms, because these are the things that we're looking for on your forms. And so if you think about them ahead of time and you get them in there, then you can save us time, because if I get one that's really good, then I can usually send the approval email out right away. If I get one that is going to take me a lot of time to get through, then I have to wait till I have a lot of time to sit down with that and go through it. So the better job you do of explaining your study in your IRB protocol, the quicker the whole process is going to go. Okay. So there are some issues in terms of recruitment. As I mentioned, equitable selection, we've already talked about that, making sure that you're choosing the people for a reason that makes sense, not just a practical reason. One of the big issues that comes up with recruitment, however, is the possibility of coercion. And one of the most common things that we deal with on this are people who want to do research on their students or do research on their employees. And you know, on the one hand, they say, well, you know, my students wouldn't feel like they have to do it. And maybe they wouldn't. But there are probably some students who might feel like, oh, they're asking me to do this, they're going to be grading me, so maybe I need to do this. Right? And so what we're talking about here isn't really coercion. We're not saying that, you know, anyone is going up to potential participants and saying, hey, you better do this study if you want to get an A in this class, right? But the possibility of perceived coercion, the possibility that it could look bad or look like someone might be taking advantage of people. And so there are still ways that you can get around this. You know, there's nothing absolute. You can never do research with your own students or with people that you know well. But there are ways that you can get around it rather than directly asking people. So some of the things that we've suggested to people, or that we have people do, would be indirect recruitment. If you are a boss at a company and you want to do research on your employees, you don't go to a meeting and say, okay, who's in? Raise your hand, right? Because everybody's going to say, yes, I'll do it. You could do something more indirect, like if it's anonymous, just leave the surveys in the break room and let people fill it out and turn it into a box, and you won't even know who did it. You could also indirectly recruit by hanging signs and saying, if you're interested in this, you know, call this number, rather than announcing it at a meeting. You could also have third-party recruitment. And so a lot of times what we have teachers do is to have another teacher come in and announce the study and get the consent forms, so that way the teacher doesn't know who's participating and who's not. And a lot of this, you know, again, they wouldn't necessarily be trying to treat these people differently, but a lot of times we can have biases that come into play or that people perceive even when they're not there. So there are things you can do to minimize this. And so if you have a relationship to your participants, then you want to think about what you can do to minimize this sort of thing. Even if they're your friends, you know, the other people in your grad program, you want to ask them questions. Well, if you go up to them directly and just ask them, they might feel like they have to say yes. So we might suggest doing something more indirect, like sending an email or putting up signs. It's easier to ignore an email than it is to tell somebody to their face, no, I don't want to do your stupid study, okay? And so we can use more indirect ways like that. Another issue that can come up with recruitment is compensation. Compensation is different from benefits. Benefits are things you get directly as a result of the research. So a benefit might be increased knowledge. It might be that you get a drug that might help your disease. Compensation is payment. And this is where you're paying people for the time or the inconvenience to be in your study. One thing that you need to know for this is that large amounts of compensation can seem coercive. And probably since most of you are students, you don't have large amounts of money to offer people, or you would use it for yourself. So that's probably not going to be an issue for you. Okay. But what might be an issue for you is if you do want to compensate your participants in some way, giving them small gift cards or giving them $5. There are some particular rules, and these are not IRB rules, but we let people know about them, that OBO, the Office of Business Operations, has related to the IRS regulations. So if you have potential participants in your study who are either UNI employees or UNI students, you may need, if you're giving them anything, cash or cash value, like a gift card, that needs to be reported to the Office of Business Operations. And in some cases with students, it may also need to be financial aid may also need to be notified. And so you want to be aware of this, and you can talk to us. We're still kind of working through these policies a little bit, but it's something that you'll want to be aware of, both in terms of the name of your study. So you wouldn't want to name your study like people with severe mental disorders and then turn in a list of those names of faculty that fit that to the Office of Business Operations, right? So you might want to have a more generic name for your study. You also want to put in the consent form that people can have the option, if they don't want their name sent to this office, that they can also refuse the participation. Basically, the office wants to keep track of it for tax purposes. So just keep in mind that there's additional things to deal with if you're offering anyone money that could fall into those categories, or gift cards. Okay, and as I mentioned, the students as participants is a particular issue that comes up. I'll just say that where you can, if you can avoid using your own students or employees, that's better. If you can't, then like I mentioned, there are some ways that we can make that work a little better. Okay. And then also, just as an aside on this for recruitment, if you're doing certain types of action or ethnographic research that may carry on for a period of time, in these conditions, you want to make sure that there's sort of an ongoing process in mind in terms of how to get consent and participation. So if you're participating in a group doing participant observation for a year, you know, how are you going to make sure that people still want to be involved in this research and they're still okay with you being there? So again, some additional things to think about related to that. Okay, second issue, risks. There are a lot of kinds of risks in research, and the ones that we come up with most easily are the physical ones. But there are also psychological, economic, political, stress, embarrassment, and so on. The biggest risks in the research that we review at UNI are probably risks to confidentiality. So if you get people to fill out a questionnaire, or you ask them questions, and then your roommate sees the data and finds out something about these people, that's a risk. Okay. So if you are interviewing people about their coming out experiences, you don't want to leave those where people can find them, especially if they haven't come out to everyone yet. And so you want to keep those sorts of issues in mind. There can also be risks in terms of embarrassment, in terms of psychological risks, upsetting people, making them feel bad. And in those cases, again, you want to do things to try to minimize those risks and also to take them away at the end. So if you're doing a study, and it might be pretty minimal risk, you're going to have people watch a video that makes them sad, so you can find out about how sadness affects people. Well, you know, one minimal thing you can do is at the end of the study, do something to make them happy again. Right? So you can give them a candy bar, or you can have them watch a funny movie, or do something to kind of restore their mood. And so you want to think about those kinds of things. Again, there's a question on the form that asks about risks, and you don't want to say there's no risk. There's always some risk. Think through it. What are the worst things that could happen? Could people be upset by this? One of the things that I always tell my students relates to a study that some of my friends did when I was in graduate school. And they were having people look at pictures in a magazine, either of men. These were all ads from normal magazines, not like Playgirl, but they were like, Cosmo or Glamour, ads of men in sexy poses, so maybe with their shirt off or with their muscles or stretching or, whatever, what I'm talking about, or pictures that were not so sexy of men, kind of just there in a business suit or handing something off. And they wanted to see the effects this had on some various things. And so one of the things in the study was that they had people look at these pictures. And none of us thought that this would be a big deal. I mean, these were, again, from like Glamour and Cosmo, and these were college women looking at it. And, we figure they see these sorts of things all the time. It's no big deal. But at the end of the study, they actually had one of their participants start to cry because she was upset because her religious beliefs included that thinking of men in those sorts of ways was a sin. And she felt really bad for having looked at those pictures. Even though, again, we think that in most cases it wouldn't make a difference, there are some people that it might be upset. And so when you're thinking about your procedure, really think about not just, what most people think, but are there some people who might be particularly vulnerable, might be upset, and what are you going to do about it? If you're doing a study where people might be upset, they fall apart during your study, you need to have a game plan. So you're not just, okay, what are you going to do? Do you have the number for the counseling office? Do you have 2 people running the study, so maybe one could talk to them? If there's anything that might upset people or things like that, you want to have those things in mind. Okay, so risk to participants, again, they should be reasonable in terms of the benefits, and that you never have no risks. You might have no foreseeable risks. You might have minimal risks. Another phrase we use is risks are no different than day-to-day life. Those are all okay phrases. No risks is not okay. There's always something. Okay, also issues of privacy. So related to privacy and confidentiality, you want to make sure that you put things into account to try to protect people's privacy and confidentiality. And again, this is probably the main risk in most of the stuff that we do. If you have all your data with people's names on it on your laptop and your laptop gets stolen, that's a lot of information that people didn't want to get out there that now is potentially out there. Or if there's a breach on your computer system or so on. Okay. So one of the things that we ask about on the form relate to what identifiers you have and what you're going to do with them. And this is, I think it's F1 on the questionnaire, on the standard questionnaire, and this is the question that I probably have to ask people about the most. So star this when you're filling out your own applications, make sure you answer all the parts of the question. There's about 4 parts there. First thing says, are there any identifiers? And some people think, oh, I'm not getting names, so there's no identifiers. But there are still things that you might be getting that are identifiers. IP number, if you're doing computer research, is an identifier. Gender, age, zip code, race, all of those are identifiers. And they can be very identifiable in some situations. If you're interviewing school principals in Iowa and you have the type of school they're at, whether it's rural or urban, the race, age, and gender of the principal, you might be able to identify them. There might be only one Asian American female principal in her 40s at a junior high. Okay. So that's making that person now completely identifiable. So you want to list any identifiers you're getting, even if you don't think that they're going to identify people specifically. And then you want to talk about how you're going to store the data, how you're going to keep things confidential if you have tapes or make video or audio recordings, how are you going to protect those files? One thing obviously is you don't want to put their names on the files. You want to keep the names in a separate file. And it also asks about who will have access to the data. So you want to, maybe you and your advisor or your research team, but you don't want to have other people that have access more generally. You want to keep it in a secure place. Okay. And as I said, remember that several vague identifiers can go together to make them more identifiable. Confidentiality on the internet is a particular concern, and there's actually a lot of interesting stuff going on in terms of internet research. And I went to an IRB conference last December where I found out that there's apparently research that, or not research, but there are new programs that people are developing to identify people based on their keystrokes. So basically, how hard you hit certain keys can be individually identifiable, and so they're developing programs that can do that and be able to link that back to people. So there may even be some data that's collected on the internet that we don't think is identifiable now that might be identifiable later, which is kind of scary. But one of the things you at least want to make sure with internet data is that you're using a site that has firewalls and protections. So you don't want to just throw it up on any internet site. Make sure that it's got good security procedures in. And we also have a statement on the consent form that we have people put, just to remind people that if they're sending data over the internet, there is a possibility that people could intercept that data. If it's anonymous, that's probably not such a big deal, but if you're giving your diagnosis with regard to HIV and it's got your name, that might be a very big deal. So we want to make sure people are aware of those. And kind of related to that, going into informed consent more. Again, from the Belmont Report, the main thing in informed consent is you want to make sure that people are voluntarily doing this. And it's probably the most important thing in research is to make sure that people know what the risks are and that they freely agree to it. They know what's involved. So according to the federal regulations, you need to get consent from each prospective person, and you need to document that consent in some way. It doesn't mean that everyone has to sign a consent form. That's one way to do it, but there might be other ways that are appropriate in other situations, but you want to make sure that it is documented. Consent should be thought of as a process, not a form. So what's important is not so much what's in the form, though we do pay attention to that because that's what we can see, but how do you explain this to people? How do you give them a chance to ask questions? How do you make sure that they understand what they're agreeing to? You want to make sure there's no coercion, like we talked about before. You want to make sure it's understandable. I've read consent forms that were to be given to adults of children in a disadvantaged area, so who on average might not have high education, that I couldn't understand. You want to make sure to make it as simple as possible. Make sure that it's in language that they're going to understand, whether they're a child or an adult, and I would say make it in simpler language than it has to be. And there are 8 required elements of consent and 6 other things according to the regulations. We have a nice informed consent checklist online that you can go through and just make sure that you have everything in there. I would say that's the confidentiality question and the consent form having everything in it are probably 80% of the things that I have to ask people about or I have to ask for modifications on. So if you get those right to start with, again, the process will go a lot quicker. So you want to think about when you're doing the consent process, what would you want to know if you were going to do a study or if you were going to participate in something? First, you need to tell them that it's research and tell them what they have to do. How long is this going to take? What are they expected to do? And you don't have to tell them, you're going to fill out the Smith & Wesson gun control questionnaire and the blah, blah, blah. You don't have to necessarily give them the names of every measure. You don't have to tell them in ways that are going to scare them or tell them your hypothesis, but you do want to tell them what you're going to be asking them about and what you're going to do. Are they going to have to read stuff? Are they going to interact with people? Are they going to fill out questionnaires? And so on. If they're kids and you're doing this at school, you want to tell the parents what they'll miss. Are they going to miss out on math class or PE, or are they going to miss study hall? What's going to be happening? How long is it going to take? Where is it going to occur? And so on. You also want to tell them about any risks or discomforts. And again, this might just be, you may be uncomfortable discussing your opinions on some of these issues. And you want to make sure to do this in a way that it doesn't increase the risks. So I've also had ones that give away a little too much and perhaps make it more upsetting to people. So I'm trying to think of exactly what it was, but it was basically asking college men about how many people they had had sex with, and it was written up in a way to kind of imply that there was something wrong with them if the number was a certain amount. You don't want to do that sort of thing. So just, we'll ask you some questions about your sexual behaviors. Tell them any benefits they might get, and in a lot of research, they might not have benefits. It's okay, but be honest about it. The regulations require that you tell them about alternative procedures or treatments. Most cases, that's not going to be relevant here, but if you were doing a drug study. And then tell them about what you're going to do with the data. Are the data anonymous, which means there are no names associated at all, or are they confidential, which might mean that you have names, but you're going to keep them private? How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to, if you're interviewing them, would you use quotes in your paper? Would you show the video clips anywhere? Would their names be associated with it in any way? Let them know how you might use their information. If the study has more than minimal risk, a statement about compensation for injuries, which probably would be, we're not going to, but you want to tell them what the situation is. And you need to give contact information for the PI and the IRB administrator, and give them contact information in a way that they can get up with you. So if you're doing a study in Spain, you probably don't want to give them your American phone number. You might give them your email address or something. So think about the best way for them to contact you. And then a statement that it's voluntary, they can withdraw at any time without penalty. And so this is another thing. If you give people compensation for your study, and they get in and then they decide this is not really what I thought it was going to be, I want to leave, you still need to provide them that compensation. You can't take that away because they've changed their mind. You also want to make sure that they're either on letterhead, they don't have to be, that they are, or say that the research is being conducted by students or faculty at UNI. Like I said, there are different ways you can do it. You can have a written consent form, and we have samples online that are kind of, legalese sounding, but those are fine. You can also do oral consent. If you're doing interviews or phone interviews especially, oral consent makes more sense. That's fine. You just need to have those same elements of consent in there. They don't have to be stated exactly the way that we do, but we just have to make sure that information is there. If you're doing an internet survey, it could be electronically presented. So especially if it's a low-risk study, you could just have them say, click here if you agree to participate, and take them to the questionnaire. It could be presented in a letter. Especially if you're doing stuff with children, you might do it as a letter to parents and then have the parents sign it and return it. So it doesn't have to look scary. You can put it in language they can understand, put it in ways that make sense to you. You can bullet, you can write it as a letter, but you just have to have that information in it. There are cases where you might be able to get a waiver of documentation of consent. This doesn't mean that you don't consent at all, but that in some cases you might not get their signature. So for example, if you're doing an internet survey, you're not going to have their signature on the form, and that's okay. There might be other cases if it's anonymous or low risk where that makes sense too. And remember that you do need to get parental permission from kids. Okay, so once you get through the review process, you turn it in, it gets through those first people looking at it, it gets to a reviewer, you've answered all my questions, I'm happy with it, I send it back and say you're approved, you can go. Do you have to interact with us ever again? Yes, probably. There's still some other elements to it. So if you make any changes, like I mentioned before, you need to do that with a modification. There are also continuing approval, closure, adverse events. I'll mention those each briefly. So any types of changes that you make. So if the risks change, if you change how you're going to recruit people, if you change measures, if you change sites where you're doing your study, any of those, even those that were exempt from continuing review, have to go through the IRB. And this is usually a pretty quick process. What you need to do if you want to modify it is you send an email request to the IRB administrator and include that original protocol number. So when we get your first one and we send back an email, in the subject line there'll be a number, it'll say HP, and then it'll be like 11-0011, something like that. Put that original number in there, explain what you're changing, attach anything that's new, if you have a new consent form or new materials or whatever, and then she'll forward that to a reviewer and they'll get back to you and say this modification's approved. And again, some of those, especially if they get me at a good time, I can do those in 10 minutes. So you can submit it, 10 minutes later be approved. Sometimes it might take a couple days, but those should be fairly quick. Okay, you also may have to interact with us if your study was expedited or full board. After a year, again, you'll get something in the email for continuing approval. Basically this, you'll just say everything's going fine, there are no problems or whatever. If you want to avoid getting that form, if you have ended your study and you're not doing anything with the data at all anymore, you can get a project closure form. If you're still analyzing the data, you don't want to close the study though. On the continuing approval form, if you've already finished collecting everything and all you're doing is analyzing it and you don't have any identifiers on it anymore, you can get it changed to an exempt so that you don't have to keep doing the form, but you don't want to close it until you're totally done with it. But if you're done with the thesis, you're not going to do anything else with it, you can do this before you leave campus, and then we don't have to hunt you down, because then we do hunt grad students down and get them to do that. Also, if you have any adverse events, basically these might be people that get upset, your laptop with all the data gets stolen, something else happens that's a big problem, these we have to report. So you'd want to let us know if any of those occur. So again, you start with initiating your application, it goes through administrative review, then it goes out to a reviewer, you get our comments, you make changes, and then you've got the renewal or closure or changes, any of that. So it's kind of a continuing process. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and finish going through these, and then we're gonna do a little activity so you can maybe move a little bit and get pumped up and grab another Pepsi or something. The forms that we have, and these are all on the website, there's a standard application, there's another application if it's purely a survey study, nothing else. There's one for existing data, so if you're using a data set that someone already has. The renewal forms, the project closure forms, the informed consent forms, all of those are available on our website. Just go to www.uni.edu/OSP for Office of Sponsored Programs, and then you'll see human subjects down in the lower left there. In addition to the forms, when you submit those, you'll also want to make sure to submit things like your recruitment letter or script, what are you going to say to participants, copies of any instruments, your consent documents, letters of cooperation. If you're doing research at a private place, you're going into a school system, you have to also give us a letter saying that the school says this is okay. Or if you're going into a business, or like the study we talked about before, where you're going to stand outside a business and hand questionnaires, you need to give us a copy of something from those people saying that that's okay. And it doesn't have to be super formal. You can make up a form for them to sign. They can do an email as long as it's got their address and title in it. But we would need that kind of information. Debriefing scripts if you have any deception in the study that you need to tell people about. And then again, all key personnel need to go through either a training like this or the ones that are available online to make sure that they have the basic human participants training. Okay, and then this has where to find us again, Office of Sponsored Programs, click on Research Policies, and then Anita and my email addresses and phone numbers. Okay, what I want to do now, and this is a little bit of a test, I waited until after I'd talked about it for a while to see if you still remember it after sitting here listening to me talk on for a little while longer. So when you came in, you should have gotten a sheet that asks about, let me see what it's called, does the IRB need to be notified? What I'd like for you to do now is to go through these. You can go through it by yourself or go through it, if you want to discuss it with somebody beside you, but take a few minutes and look through this and just write a yes or no or a maybe or whatever. And we'll kind of talk about this to make sure that everybody's clear on which studies you do need to go through or when you do need to interact with the IRB and when you don't. Okay, I think most people have gotten through at least most of them. I'm going to go through these real quick, and I want to remind you on these that these are based on our current interpretation of regulations. The regulations, they're considering now doing some changes, and who knows how long those changes might take, but there are also reinterpretations that occur as we go along. As I said, ethics aren't in most cases black and white. There's not some things that are okay, some things that aren't. And I was talking to someone during the break about how, some of the things that we as a board have decided to generally see as okay, like some minor deceptions or things like that. There are other people that would say, no, that should never occur. And actually, in Canada a few years back, there was a ban on any research involving deception or observation. There may be differences of opinions. And so these are based on our interpretation. If you took the same exact protocol to another university, you might get slightly different responses. Hopefully the majority of the issues would be the same, but sometimes there are differences in terms of how people interpret things, and you want to be aware of that. And the main thing I think you want to do is put yourself in the participants' shoes. So, you know, if you are doing a study that might involve something that upsets people or things like that, think about what you would want to know. So, you know, is this something that would upset you, and what could we do to make it less upsetting to you? And so there might be ways that you can deal with those things through thinking about them on your own. Okay, so on the first one, the analysis of archival data, does that need to be reviewed? Yes, probably so, because if it's got personally identifiable information in it, okay? If it didn't and it was publicly available, then it would be no. How about number 2? No, okay, I just told you on that one. Number 3, yes, and you could do that through an email. Again, you wouldn't have to resubmit the whole thing. Okay, number 4, the survey at Cedar Falls Utilities. No. Number 5, observing the public behavior of adults. No. 6, yes. So even though it's a class project, if you're thinking about submitting it to a conference, you're going to be using it as more generalizable research, and so you'd need to go through review. Number 7, no, because they're not human anymore. If you're looking at death records, they're public records as well as they're no longer living humans. Number 8, yes, because even though you're working there as part of your internship, you want to use it for your thesis, it needs to go through review. Number 9, yes, you'd need to do that again through an email to say, you know, can I do it at these 2 other schools? And you'd need to get us letters of cooperation from those schools. Okay, number 10, no. Number 11, if you're using the exact same procedures, the exact same population, you don't need to resubmit it. If you're changing anything, you do. But if it was considered exempt from further review and you're not changing anything, then you can continue to collect data on that. Okay, number 12. No, all you're doing with this is looking at previous research. Basically, you're not collecting anything from people directly. Okay, number 13. Conducting a survey of human resource personnel. No, because you're not asking them about anything personal. You're just asking, what's your company? You know, how many employees do you have? Which of these perks do you have? You're not saying, how much do you like working there? If you ask that, then it would be yes. But if all you're asking is about the company, it's no. Number 14, yes, because you've got identifiable data, you're going to be presenting it. 15, yes, you'd want to do that as a modification to add that questionnaire. 16, yeah, 16 would be probably not, because if she's the only person you're interviewing, then that would be more like journalism, right? So if you were trying to interview a bunch of famous people or semi-famous people and put it together in a paper with some broader conclusions, then yes, but probably not on that one. How about number 17? Yeah, this is one that is a little in between as well, because you could say, oh, well, playground might be a public place, but when you're looking at kids, and when even though it's a class project, again, you're looking at kids, you'd probably want to still get that reviewed. Okay, number 18. 18 is another one that kind of depends. So if you're only using the results of this survey on dining services to make things better, to improve the options we have here, then it would be no. If you were definitely doing it as research, it would be yes. But if you're going to use the results to promote the dining services, you're probably using it as research. So that would be a probably. That would be one you'd want to probably talk to us about. Number 19. Analyzing coded data that was previously collected by another investigator who got IRB approval. It depends on what you're doing here. If you're looking at some new question, then you would still want to get review, but do it with an existing data application. So it's a fairly simple application. You would just say, this person has given me these data, this is what I'm going to do with it. Okay. And actually, it would be similar for number 20. Even if it's yourself, if you've closed the study and said that I'm done with that, and then you decide you want to do more with it, you need to do something to reopen that as an existing data thing. So be aware that if you close a study, that's saying, I don't want to do anything else with these data. If you are planning on continuing to do analyses, then instead fill it out as a continuation form. But if the data are de-individualized, you don't have to deal with this any further after that. You can just say that they have been. Okay, good. So it seems like y'all remembered stuff through while we were doing that. Yes?
How do you know if it's been closed or not?
The question was, how do you know if it's been closed or not? You filled out a closure form. So basically, if your study is approved as exempt from continuing review, then you don't have to worry about a closure form. But if it was expedited or full board, the regulations require that after a period of time, usually 1 year, you have to give us a report basically on how it's been going. It's a real simple form that you either say, I'm still collecting data, or I'm done, or whatever. And on that form, if you put, I'm completely done with this, I'm not going to analyze the data anymore, or anything, then that would be considered closed. If instead you say, I'm done collecting data from participants, but I have this data that's de-individualized, it's completely disconnected from names, but I might still do stuff with it, then it would still be considered open, but it would at that point become exempt, so you wouldn't have to send it in again. So, other questions, Jeff?
For number 19, I'm a little iffy on your use of the word analyze. At what point does analyzing become an IRB issue?
Okay, the question was, at what point does analyzing become an IRB issue? Analyzing is what you're doing for research. So if you're doing the analyzation as part of a research project, then that would be considered something that needs to go through the IRB. Now, if, on the other hand, there are data that your professor gives you and says, here, practice doing a factor analysis on these, and you're not concerned with the data themselves, you're just using it as a way to practice factor analysis, then that would not be IRB. So if the broader idea is to have some research question you're looking at, or something that you might present, or so on, then that would be considered. Even if the data are already existing, you'd need to go through the IRB. And it's a really short form for the existing data to say, this is what I'm planning to do. Good. Other questions about anything, actually? Yes?
I have a question, but it sounded as if confidentiality was always anticipated, and I'm wondering if that's the case, because I know in some qualitative research I've read, the participants actually want their name to be in there, so I'm wondering how you handle it.
Yeah, the question was regarding confidentiality and the fact that in some studies, especially qualitative studies, people might actually want their identity to be known. And that's fine. The thing that we look for is that it's clear in the consent form. So if you're doing a study and you're going to be using pictures and identifications and so on of the people, as long as that's clearly stated and they're aware of that, that's fine. And usually what we do, if you're going to be taking pictures or videos that might be shown to others, is we suggest people that have a separate line so that you sign to agree to be in the study, and then you check something that says, I also agree that you can use my name in pictures, just to make sure they're aware of it. So, yeah, good. Any other questions about anything? So you're all raring to go, and you're ready to send me these beautiful protocols that I will be able to do quickly and not have any questions on. Yeah, good confidence. I like that. And as I said, you know, I am perfectly happy if you ever want to call or email me or stop by my office to just talk about, you know, I want to do this study with this population, and I'm not sure how I can deal with this sort of thing. And I'm not saying that I'm a great research guru, but again, we get about 350 protocols a year, and I read the majority of those, and so I know a lot of things that people are doing, and so it gives me a lot of ideas for ways that you might be able to make things happen. So feel free to use me or use Anita as resources, even before you get to the point of finally designing your study, to think about how you could deal with some issues if there might be ethically questionable things going on in your study. Okay, any other? Okay, well, thank you for coming. Let me give you a couple reminders before you head out. If you can fill out the evaluation form and leave those in the box before you go. Also, if you're interested in the Ethics on Scholarship on Monday, October 3rd, let us know about that. That has to do with student-mentor relationships and other non-IRB ethical issues. Also, if you manage to get in without signing in, make sure you give Anita your name before, it's the lady in the white coat there, before you go, and otherwise you won't get your certificate sent to you and we won't know that you did this. So, thanks a lot for coming.